Erica, thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation. This is Erica Dodds. She is the Chief Operating Officer of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which just held its second annual Climate Restoration Forum, which we will certainly come back to. I wanted to first ask you, what led you to this role, but first, because some of the people watching may not be familiar with what climate restoration is, and how does that differ from reducing carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions, for instance?
So climate restoration is a pretty new idea, and it's kind of a response to all of the doom and gloom climate narrative that we hear. So climate restoration asks, what is the climate that we want for ourselves and for future generations? And how do we get there? And it establishes a goal. So our explicit climate restoration goal is to get below 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by the year 2050. And what that means in practice is that, right now people are talking a lot about getting to net zero emissions. And that means that there will be some amount of emissions still happening, but will be taking out an equal amount of CO2. So on net, there will be no emissions. What we're talking about with climate restoration is going way beyond that, going to like 50 billion tons per year net negative. So that means, yes, reduce emissions, yes, balance those out with carbon removal, and then go far beyond removing a lot more carbon dioxide than that. Because until you get that legacy CO2 out of the atmosphere, the stuff that we've been emitting for the last 200 years, we will still have warming, we will still have extreme weather, all of the severe impacts of climate change, will be better than they would be if we did nothing, but will still be very bad. So in order to get to a climate that we really want, and we know that humans and our natural world can survive and thrive in, we need climate restoration. So that's our goal.
That makes sense, and I think that's an important thing to point out, in that it's not it's kind of like it's a all hands on deck approach in terms of, yes, absolutely reduce emissions, but I understand your point that that's alone is not going to do anything about all the carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere. So therefore, to get to that 300 parts per million goal, we need to take it out now.
Yeah, and people have been hearing about emissions reduction for decades, right? So for most people, all they know about the climate is it has to do with emissions. And most people have no idea that those emissions stay in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So yeah, stopping all emissions is not enough anymore, and it hasn't been enough for almost 30 years. Once we crossed the safe threshold, it was no longer ever going to be enough to just stop emissions, because again, that CO2 had already built up to an unsafe level.
I'm curious what led you to, obviously it being in your family, your mom and dad are the founders of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. So I get that connection, but clearly you've been working on this, you've been interested in it for a while. I'm just kind of curious what your path has been to get you to this point where you're now the Chief Operating Officer of this. It's such an integral role in the climate restoration movement.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that, having climate restoration in the family was more of a hindrance than anything, because I never wanted to be seen as like following in the easy path that my parents had laid down. And really, I was avoiding any conversation about climate with my parents for quite a while. But one day, out of curiosity, I finally asked my dad, Peter, what exactly it was that he was doing, because he had just been to the COP, so, the top climate conference in the world in Morocco. And I was like, what is this guy doing? Like, he's a physicist with a software business. Like, why is he going to this climate conference? Like, what is he thinking? So I finally asked him what it was that he was doing with climate, like why was he at this COP? And he told me about climate restoration. He said, doesn't it seem weird that our whole conversation about climate is focused on the negative impacts and how can we make it less terrible? You know, maybe if we work really hard, it can only be pretty terrible. But no one is talking about the outcome that we want and how to get there. And it turns out it's not that complicated. On a physical level, you know, there's too much CO2 and we need to remove it. And of course, there are a whole lot of other variables, but most of them are connected in one way or another to this key problem. And we've had technologies that can remove CO2 from air ever since we started putting humans in sealed capsules like submarines and spaceships. So, you know, we know how to do this. It's just a matter of doing it at a much larger scale, much more efficiently. And I had really never considered any of that before. You know, I'd never considered that our goals are not aligned with the outcomes that we want. I hadn't considered that that emissions reduction isn't enough. I hadn't considered that that it was even possible to get carbon dioxide out of the air, or that that was something we should be doing. And it just kind of threw me for a loop. And when it came time for me to move cross country and find a new job, I was like, well, maybe this is the time to jump into this new space, because, you know, it had really been on my mind. So I started doing some part-time work with the group that my parents had started, and that morphed into the foundation, and I finished my PhD and was able to move to full-time, and that's when I stepped into this role. I've always really enjoyed organizing things, and I've always cared about doing work that's really meaningful to me. So this has been a really good fit.
Kind of like the nexus of all those things, right?
Right. And, you know, my background has always been in international development and poverty reduction. And the connection between international development and climate is so complex and so interrelated.
Yes.
And my PhD is in evaluation of international development programs. So again, you know, you can't have successful international development or poverty reduction without taking into account climate, and trying to do any of these things effectively requires strong evaluation and critical thinking. So it's been a really fun way to kind of bring all of these paths together.
What a cool story. That's so funny that you didn't want to have anything to do with the family conversation for so many years, and then finally we're like, maybe I could ask about this.
Yeah.
You are. Glad you asked that question.
Me too.
Yeah, you make a really good point about how connected, you know, the human race is to our climate. It's the one thing that unites all of us. That impacts, I would say, impacts first all of us, and then should we choose to act on it, it's the one thing that can unite all of us. You've shared kind of your path of how you got to this point, and one question led to another, and you took the opportunity to jump into to working with the foundation. Why is climate restoration, why is this so important to you?
I mean, I think it's important to everyone. One of the things that we say a lot within the Foundation for Climate Restoration is that there are no enemies on this path. You know, there's no one who doesn't want a healthy climate. So for me, it's really interesting to be working in this area that people think of as being really contentious, right? There's so much conversation about how do we get climate deniers to change their minds? How do we convince them that this is important? But ultimately, it's really about our values as a global community. And everyone has, when it comes down to it, everyone has very similar values. Everyone wants their future generations to thrive. Everyone wants a world that can support them and their communities. And ultimately, that's the goal here.
Yes, it is. Yeah, very well said. Yeah, everyone does want it. And one of the questions I have I'll come back to later is why isn't everyone focused on this? It might have something to do with can we not, is there something that we can do about it or not? I think most people in today's world are aware of climate change, or as I learned in the forum last week, maybe more accurately referred to as climate destabilization. That it's not that most people aren't aware of it or don't care. It's that I think the most common barrier, at least from my perspective, is people don't think that they can do anything about it. You know, they might think, I'm just one person. What could I possibly do? What would you say to someone who feels helpless or feels like because they're just one person, they can't have an impact?
I would say that they're right and they're wrong. So on the one hand, the problem is way beyond the individual scale, right? So I think that a lot of the biggest contributors to climate change have done a really good job of making all of us individuals feel like it's our job to get to zero carbon footprint and that will save us. But as we've just discussed, like that, one, individuals aren't responsible for nearly as much of the emissions or of the causes of climate change compared to, you know, larger systems, larger corporations. And as an individual, you know, my best intentions aren't going to change the oil and gas industry. But that doesn't mean that my individual voice can't serve as a rudder, right, in steering things into a better direction. So I think one, you know, as an individual, you can do a lot to reduce your own carbon footprint. And if we're thinking about getting to a huge net negative emissions, that means that the smaller our existing carbon footprint, or the smaller our emissions today, the smaller the overall pie we need to encompass, right? So if you can reduce your own emissions, your own carbon footprint, that will definitely help. What will help even more is using your voice. So one of the things that we talk about is that no one seems to know about climate restoration yet. So just letting people know that this is a possibility, that it's something they can ask for, makes a big difference, because until there's a public movement demanding that we restore the climate, there's not a lot of backing, you know, even for policymakers who buy in right away and really want to do something about this. If they're hearing from one constituent, that's not enough to give them the feeling that they have the support of their constituency to move this forward. So one of the things that we're working on right now is developing a local chapters program so that people can form communities around them globally and learn together to talk about climate restoration, to form relationships with their local representatives, to form community meetings and groups so that they can just get the conversation going, both just interpersonally, on social media, with their policymakers, et cetera, and really just bring this to the next level. I think there are a lot of organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby that do incredible advocacy work for climate-related issues at the national level. And we love that they're doing that work, and a lot of their groups have started taking on climate restoration issues. Our focus right now is going from the local level and from the intergovernmental level. So we're working with UN representatives as well as city and county representatives. And what we've heard from both of them is that going from those two ends really reinforces one another. And there are a lot fewer roadblocks at the local level than there are at the others. So we see this as a really leverageable place to work. Not to mention it's a little bit less intimidating as an individual who has no advocacy experience to meet with a city council member compared to a senator.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot you can do. And I would really urge people, you mentioned the feeling of overwhelm and powerlessness, and I love talking about eco-anxiety. I think that's definitely one of the biggest things that people are facing when it comes to the climate, is feeling exactly what you're expressing, this anxiety and powerlessness. And the more you can take concrete steps that enforce your values, the better you'll feel about the state of the world. And I think that, yeah, using your voice to promote something like climate restoration, spread the word, and engage your community is a really great way to do that.
I love that message, Erica, of, first of all, what you were saying about both local and county representatives and national, and how they kind of reinforce and kind of, I don't know if buffer is the right word, but kind of support if the message is being talked about and worked on and brainstormed and it's in the conversation at all levels. And there are some amazing things that can happen on the starting at the local level, such as I remember hearing David, I can't remember his last name, but the Santa Clara County supervisor, the things that they have done in Santa Clara County in California are incredible, and models for counties, places, towns, cities around the world. And to your other point of what can people do, yes, we can work on our own carbon footprint. However, I would say, and use your voice. If you care about it, use your voice, share about these things. For those watching, so Erica's father, Peter Fiakowski, spoke at a conference I was attending in, I think it was 2017. 2017, 2018, doesn't matter. But I remember going up to him and thanking him for what he was working on. And I said, what can we do, Peter? Like, what I want to be able to do something. And you know what he said to me, to your point, Erica? Tell everyone, your friends, your family, people you meet, that we actually can restore the climate. It is possible. So that's a message that we can all take with us, that I think that does kind of address, and for me, mitigates the ego anxiety that you're speaking of. It's really great. Thank you for that. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the solutions. We've been talking about the need to take the legacy carbon, the carbon that we're still pumping into the atmosphere now, out, right? Because we're well over the identified safe, livable, healthy level of carbon. So what are some of the technologies that you're excited about that are being worked on, or have already been proven to be scalable in order to actually sequester carbon to remove it from the atmosphere?
There are so many of them. And I think the thing I'm most excited about is the fact that there are so many. There are new technologies being developed all the time. When we look at solutions to think about how well they fit with our goal of climate restoration, we look at 3 key criteria. Those are financeability, scalability, and permanence. So financeability means, is there financing available for this? And of course, there's public and private financing. We think that public financing moves too slowly most of the time. So there are a lot of ways that a carbon fee and dividend, for example, would be a huge leverage to helping climate restoration solutions get financed and implemented. But we aren't doing that right now. We don't have a fee and dividend. So what are the things that have the financing available already so that they can scale up really quickly over the next decade? The second was scalability. So we're looking at getting to 50 gigatons per year of carbon removal. So we recognize that there are a lot of solutions out there. Most of them will never reach that scale, and that's fine. But we want things that can get close so that even if a lot of things fail or can't be scaled, we still have a few solutions that can do most of the work, and we don't fall short of our goal. So we're looking at solutions that can get to close to 25 billion tons, 25 gigatons of carbon removal per year. And thirdly is permanence. So there are a lot of solutions out there like direct air carbon capture that in and of themselves can't do climate restoration just because the carbon is not permanently removed. So if you put carbon dioxide into a soda and then you drink the soda, then it's released again. Or if you turn captured CO2 into jet fuel and then you use the jet fuel, then it's released again. And it's still way better, right, than using fossil fuels for these things. But it's recycling, right? It's not getting to a negative carbon footprint. So we want things that can keep carbon out of circulation for a century or more. So when you have these three criteria, it gets a lot harder to find things that work. Fortunately, we're not the only ones using these criteria. It's becoming very common for people, as they're innovating new carbon removal solutions, to be thinking in this way. And so we're seeing a lot more people focusing on things like building materials. It's not arbitrary. It's because when you put carbon into things like concrete, cement, synthetic rocks, you can sequester it permanently. There's an almost 50 billion ton market for rocks every year. It's the largest, it's the most used product on Earth after water. So being able to put carbon into this space is a huge, huge opportunity in terms of scale, in terms of dollars. People are already buying building materials, and it's a really easy swap for something that we're already using. So there's a huge opportunity there. I'll just say when you start looking at building materials, there are a lot of different options. There's injecting carbon dioxide into cement, which is like the glue that holds concrete together. Most people have no idea that cement is only like 10 to 20% of concrete. The rest of it is rock, gravel, sand, water. So looking at this huge market for concrete, the cement is actually a pretty small portion of that. So still huge market, but not huge quite at the scale that we're looking at. But then when you start looking at turning CO2 into rocks that can be used in concrete, the rocks and sand are 60 or so percent depending on the mix. So that's a much larger portion, and there are a few companies that are working on that. One of them is in the Bay Area, one of them is in the UK, and I suspect that there will be many others in the next few years because it is a huge, huge market, and great PR for the manufacturers. So that's one kind of segment of the solutions, and the other is mostly photosynthesis. Let me just get my cat out of here. Okay, so photosynthesis. When we talk about needing to remove carbon dioxide, most people think of planting trees first, and that makes a lot of sense. We learn really early on that plants use photosynthesis. They capture carbon dioxide, they release oxygen, and that's, exactly what we need, right? And I'm not going to downplay it. That is exactly what we need. Plants do an excellent job of this. They've been doing it for millions, billions of years. So, yes, that's definitely something we need more of. Part of the problem with climate change is that we've been throwing off this natural carbon cycle that used to keep carbon kind of balanced between the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere. So we've taken all of this carbon that was stored in fossil fuels in the geosphere, and we've burned them and released that carbon into the atmosphere while simultaneously depleting the biosphere. So we had all of these plants that could absorb the CO2, and we've been, deforesting, and we've been changing the balance of animals on the planet. So we have all these cows releasing methane, where we used to have trees absorbing carbon dioxide. So we've really done a great job of kind of messing with the natural cycle. Of course, restoring that natural cycle, stopping burning fossil fuels, planting more trees, restoring these ecosystems will do a lot to combat that problem. And there's so much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we can reasonably take out in only a few decades with plants. We've just done too much damage at this point for that to be the solution. It's just a solution that's clearly part of this portfolio. But another thing that people don't know is that photosynthesis in the ocean can actually store a lot more carbon dioxide than plants on land. So photosynthesis in the ocean happens mainly with microalgae like plankton and macroalgae like kelp. And kelp is pretty incredible. It can grow up to 1 meter per day. So that's about 2 to 3 feet per day. It's the most efficient photosynthesizer on the planet, and it has a market. It can be used as food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals. It can restore ecosystems. You know, there are all kinds of marine animals in the ocean that can eat kelp or, you know, use it for homes, or I don't really know. Anyways, so having kelp forests is really good for ocean habitats. And again, because there's a market, it's commercially viable. The other great thing about kelp is that, one, it's not on land, so it doesn't compete for traditional agriculture space. So you're not going to have to replace farms with forests in order to use kelp forests. And if there are wildfires or hurricanes or things that do a ton of damage to our ecosystems, kelp is safe. It's underwater. So it doesn't burn, it doesn't rot. And when it dies, you can sink it to the deep ocean where the carbon that it's absorbed is sequestered for hundreds to thousands of years. So solutions like creating kelp forests in ocean deserts in places where there are not enough minerals and ecosystems have been destroyed is a really great way to both restore ecosystems while also sequestering a lot more carbon than you would be able to otherwise. So
such a great point. Honestly, you know, we think about, it's the traditional model, as you say, photosynthesis, trees, plants on land. How can we reforest? Which, as you say, is a very important part of the solution, but not the whole picture. And especially when you have, one of my teachers would be upset that I remember this, but what percentage of the earth is ocean, and how much of an opportunity there is to be able to utilize that in a way that you say is not only is it abundant and accessible, but the speed at which kelp grows, for instance, and the fact that when it's dead, it just gets naturally sequestered. That process can function as normal. So really, really big opportunity to be able to speak to. You also mentioned something that I think is really important to bring up here in terms of the markets that there are for these technologies and solutions. And I remember, I want to make sure I get her name right, Graciela Chilchinsky, who is a professor of economics at Columbia University and also the CEO of an organization called the Global Thermostat, mentioned the common misconception that climate restoration would actually be detrimental to the economy. Could you speak to why that's a myth?
yeah, you know, most people don't realize that there are climate restoration solutions and carbon removal solutions that are commercially viable. So most people, when they think about dealing with climate change, they think about doing things that cost a lot of taxpayer dollars, things that are not going to produce any revenue, but that need to be done. They think of it like philanthropy almost. And there's a lot in the news about how expensive things like direct air capture are. And I mean, that's true. It is costly, but you can use the carbon that's captured for commercially viable goods. So it's not like you're spending this money with no return. And in fact, there are more and more places that are starting to create a market for that carbon dioxide to be used in commercial goods. So there are a lot of opportunities to, continue building this market that's self-sustaining, and people don't know that.
Right.
In fact, there are places you can go. I think there's at least 4 different indexes or databases where you can find out about companies that are doing that are using carbon sequestration or carbon removal as part of their business, and you can see there are hundreds of them. I think over 600 at this point.
Wow.
So this is not a small industry. It's getting cheaper every day and generating a lot of jobs.
This is it's so important, I think, to dispel that old paradigm. It's just not true. Especially, I had no idea there were that many companies doing that. So another thing that inspires me and gives me a lot of hope is the fact that it's now economically viable, in a direct contrast to that old paradigm. I want to round out this conversation, Erica, with what we've been speaking to this whole time, of that this is kind of an all hands on deck approach. I really want to be able to drive this home for the viewer, of that your voice is incredibly important in terms of, and I would say that goes for, contacting your local representatives and state and government representatives, and letting your voice be heard that way, in addition to sharing with friends and family. Is there anything else that, in addition to contributing how we can and how we would choose to with our own carbon footprint, anything that what should we be focusing on right now? Is there anything else you'd add to where can we spend our time and energy such that we can have a part in restoring a healthy climate for our planet and future generations?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer to this one, honestly. I think using your voice is a key thing. There are organizations like the Foundation for Climate Restoration and many others out there that are doing work towards this goal. At this point, not many of them are using the term climate restoration. So if you're part of an environmental organization, you can tell them that you would like them to start working on climate restoration as well. For most organizations, it really wouldn't take much to add that to their missions. And realistically, everyone wants this, right? So it's not a big lift. So growing the network of organizations working towards climate restoration, engaging with whatever organization speaks to you, and using your dollars. So a lot of these organizations, like the Foundation for Climate Restoration, are nonprofits, and we depend on support from people like you to keep us running. So it definitely makes a big difference to become a donor, especially a monthly donor.
That's a great way to be involved regularly with organizations like the Foundation for Climate Restoration that are on the front lines of this. And I think you make a good point too about let's make sure that climate restoration is in the conversation, not just, there are a lot of different efforts, but you make, again, another point that we all want the same thing. So no matter the approach, no matter the phrase, we want the same thing. But the importance of the fact that we must restore the climate makes this important to have this particular focus. Is there anything else that you feel that we've left out of this conversation, Erica, that would be worthwhile? And we've covered a lot, I know, but anything else that you wanted to add or share about work that the Foundation is doing, or that, maybe anything about the forum, last week's forum, that you'd want to mention? There may not.
A few things.
Okay,
yes, good. Definitely. So first off, it's been a really incredible journey to be part of this Foundation for Climate Restoration team over the last year and a half. We did our first forum last September, at the UN headquarters in New York, and it was so great to have you there for that. And, as an organizer of that event, it was very challenging. We were a really new organization. People hadn't heard of climate restoration yet. They hadn't heard of our team. And pulling together, we were lucky enough to get a really incredible slate of speakers for that event. But we had to work really hard up until the last minute to pull them together and to make sure they understood enough of what we were doing to be able to speak meaningfully to it. And they did a wonderful job. This year, I think you mentioned, we had a lot of speakers. We had over 40 speakers from all different sectors. So scientists, engineers, professors, innovators, entrepreneurs, financiers, just all kinds of people. And the most amazing thing to me as an organizer was that people reached out to us. They heard that we were having this event and they said, "Hey, can I be a speaker?" Even up until the last minute, people were really wanting to be involved because they know what we're up to and they know how our work aligns with theirs. So it's really wonderful to see how much the movement has grown just in the last year. Doing it virtually was also really amazing because we were able to get people tuning in from all over the world. And now we have recordings of all 6 of the sessions. And so now I'm watching on YouTube as we're getting hundreds of views on these recordings. So it's great to see that the message and the mission are really resonating with people, all kinds of people all over the world. Secondly, I just wanted to add a little bit of color to the goal of climate restoration. As a global community, we've really treated climate change as something scientific. And science is really helpful when it comes to explaining, describing, predicting what's happening in the world. So when it comes to really examining the problem of climate change, what it looks like, where it's headed, that is exactly the role of physical science. And Dr. Chichelnitsky, as you mentioned, really drew a great parallel between what's the role of physical versus social science. And she pointed out that we've been so focused on what is the shape of the problem, we haven't looked at what the source is. And the source is really from our systems, from our society. So making those social changes is really critical to affecting the physical problem. And, I think people don't quite see that scientists' job isn't to fix the problem. Their job is to really distinguish it, make it really clear to everyone. And then it's up to us as a society to make those changes. And it's up to engineers to engineer solutions to the physical problem. So the physical problem being the carbon dioxide. But it's really hard for engineers to do that job if they don't have a specific goal, if they don't have the parameters that they're working under. So that's why we're so specific. We hear sometimes that 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide, that's too low. It's higher than we had before the Industrial Revolution, which is why we've chosen that level. We know that it's safe for humans in the natural world. We don't really know that about any other level of CO2. But, it is a really ambitious goal. It's a target that we don't know for certain that we will achieve. But that's true of any ambitious goal. So we're not too deterred by that. But having this concrete goal of 300 parts per million, having this timeline of by 2050 allows us to see, okay, what is the scale that we need to reach? And then to engineer things that can achieve that scale. And, like I mentioned, there aren't many things that can meet all of our criteria. So the fact that there are so many brilliant engineers working to do this is really encouraging. And I think as someone who's new to the space, I think it's a really interesting exercise when you hear about a new carbon removal solution to think about our 3 criteria. So again, that's financeability, scalability, and permanence. And ask yourself, does this meet all 3? And it's really interesting to see how many of them fall short on 1 or 2 or all 3. And, that doesn't mean anything problematic. It just means let's not put all of our eggs in any one basket and let's keep our eyes set on the goal.
Yes, all hands on deck. Absolutely. It makes me so happy to hear that about, last year being the first event, kind of a lot of work going into organizing the speakers and getting people aligned, and how this year people were a demand for participating and they were coming to you. It was magnetizing what you all are putting together. And may that continue and grow and grow and grow.
Yes.
Thank you for really creating for all of us the opportunity of this, and how with such a large, sometimes seemingly cumbersome, inaccessible issue, that there are specific actionable things we can do, and to have a target to work towards, and to especially this 3-part process that you mentioned of financeability, scalability, and permanence is such a great way to be able to evaluate some of our most viable solutions. Erica, where can people find you and find the work of the foundation?
You can find us on our website at f4cr.org, so foundationforclimaterestoration.org, or F and the number 4cr.org, or on any social media platform. Just search Foundation for Climate Restoration and we are there.
Okay, great. And I will link to those YouTube videos that I've been enjoying, because there's just so much great content there.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for this, this opportunity, and really enjoyed this conversation.